he was introduced in 1938 by creators Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, DC's Superman has come to be associated with three basic powers: flight, super strength, and heat vision. One might even call these the definitive cliched comic book powers. However, it's no secret that Superman's abilities have changed more times over the years than comic universes have been rebooted. That's a lot. In addition to those abilities we just mentioned, you've also got his super breath, speed, invincibility, X-ray vision, and overall extrasensory, well, senses. Today we'll be taking a look at the history of the extraordinary gifts given to Clark Kent and how they've changed since he crash-landed on Ma and Pa Kent's farm 80 years ago. You might be surprised to learn that when he first appeared in the pages of Action Comics #1, Supes wasn't really that super. He had no laser vision or incredible lung capacity. At this point, the Kryptonian refugee was just super strong and super fast, while also being able to jump an eighth of a mile. He couldn't even fly. Just think about that. Poor Superman stuck on the ground like the rest of us poor schmoes. More importantly, the source of his power being chalked up to Earth's yellow sun had not been thought up yet. The explanation behind his abilities was that upon reaching maturity, the people of his race, meaning Kryptonians, became gifted with titanic strength. While 1938 took place during the golden age of comic books, Superman wasn't that all-American golden boy he would become. Someone described this approach as tame compared to the Superman we all know and love today. By Kryptonian standards, at least in 1938, he wasn't all that special, and to make matters sort of worse, he was a little too powerful. The concept of kryptonite being Superman's greatest weakness wasn't invented until the late 40s. Next, we come to the Silver Age of comic books, where Superman as we know him began to really take shape. Running from the mid-50s to around 1970, the Silver Age is often characterized as a resurgence in the popularity of superhero-based comic books, as they had fallen out of favor following World War II. Comics about crime, horror, and romance took over the market, but when some wise guy and/or gal created an alleged link between comics and juvenile delinquency, the Comics Code Authority was created by publishers in order to regulate the industry. The introduction of the CCA gave superheroes a fresh lease on life. In particular, Superman really needed a kickstart because, as of DC writer Will Jacobs once put it, the Superman comics were of great quantity but little quality. As writers like Kurt Swan, Julius Schwartz, Mort Weisinger, and Paul Levitz got their hands on the character, new powers began to take shape. For one thing, Clark wasn't just a great jumper anymore. Now he could actually fly, and his strength was retconned as being a byproduct of Earth's own sun. Ah, the retcon. It's a favorite device of comic book writers, basically allowing them to alter the past or aspects of a certain character without having it contradict any established facts that came before. Other abilities introduced during the Silver Age were Superman's iconic heat ray vision, X-ray vision, freezing breath, and super speed, which was close but not equal to that of the Flash, who enjoyed a great renaissance during this period. And since this was the 50s and America was putting a greater emphasis on education in an effort to compete with the Soviet Union during the Cold War space race, Clark also became extremely smart with an eidetic memory to boot. As added bonuses, Superman got psychic abilities like hypnotism and telekinesis, as well as his near invulnerability, enhanced hearing and stamina, massive lung capacity, and a healing factor whose effectiveness varied on the writer's whims. Just to remind you what decade it was, they had him survive some atomic blasts. Remember kids, duck and cover! Or hide in the fridge, apparently that works too. Then there were some weird ones like super weaving, super ventriloquism, super mathematics, breaking the time barrier, and that ability to shoot tiny versions of himself out of his hands. Wait, really? That's great. One of the coolest Superman powers of the Silver Age was his ability to travel back in time. In the 1960 story Superman's Return to Krypton, he flew too fast while pursuing a creature out in space and broke the time barrier. This caused him to travel back in time to before Krypton was destroyed, and his powers began to wane as he got nearer to the planet's red sun. Nevertheless, the Silver Age forged that godlike reputation Superman has, one that would be explored later in film by dudes like Zack Snyder in Man of Steel and Batman v Superman. Getting back to Superman's many powers, the guy was kind of a joke when the Bronze Age rolled around. During this period of comics from around 1970 to 1986, publishers opted for darker storylines that alluded to relevant societal issues such as drugs, racism, and even urban poverty. In the words of Marty McFly, this was some seriously heavy stuff. In January of 1971, writer Denny O'Neil began an 8-part adventure with Superman number 233. By the end, Superman's powers had been reduced by a third because O'Neil felt that he was just too dang powerful, and once you're basically a god, you're no longer compelling as a character. Once he left the comic, however, Superman's abilities skyrocketed like Apple stock in 2007. One thing to note about the Bronze Age is that while Superman still had all his powers, they now required more effort to use, making him less of that omnipotent being readers saw during the Silver Age. Despite this, readers would witness the zenith of Superman's demythologization during the modern age of comics. For DC, the publication that would connect the Bronze Age to the modern age was the now iconic Crisis on Infinite Earths. Beginning in 1985, this large-scale crossover event was meant to resolve decades of continuity issues and create one unified DC universe. Crisis was written by Marv Wolfman and drawn by George Perez, and basically dealt with the death of different universes within the DC multiverse. Once the fallout of the 12 issues had settled, writers like John Byrne could reboot characters such as Superman. Byrne's job was to revamp Clark Kent for the publisher, and he decided to take, in his own words, Superman back to the basics. It's basically Siegel and Shuster's Superman meets the Fleischer Superman in 1986. Byrne began with Man of Steel, a 6-issue miniseries in July of 1986, before moving on to write and draw 2 monthly Superman books. Byrne only wrote for Superman until 1988, but his changes to the hero were enormous, especially when it came to toning down his immense powers, which, in Byrne's universe, did not manifest themselves until Clark was already grown. He still had heat vision, freezing breath, and flight, but abilities such as enhanced stamina, invulnerability, and smarts from the Silver Age were lessened to make him more of a believable hero who could actually take damage. Moreover, he'd have to spend more time in the sun in order to build up his powers if he wanted to use them at their full strength. More interestingly, Byrne explained parts of Clark's superhero persona that were often disregarded up until that point, like why no one notices Superman as Clark Kent without glasses, or how Clark Kent could be so strong for a simple reporter. The answers are actually quite simple, yet so elegant. Superman vibrates his face at super speed in order to make it blurry, and Clark owns a weightlifting set. Even his super strength was rationalized as tactile telekinesis. With this term, Byrne explained that all Kryptonians generated a telekinetic field around themselves and can therefore move objects through their own willpower just by touching them. Byrne also did away with the Fortress of Solitude and Krypto while keeping Martha and Jonathan Kent alive in Superman's adulthood. This fresh imagining of Superman was only fleeting, however, as Byrne returned to Marvel in the late 80s, and as the years wore on, the character would steadily return to those maximum power levels, which made him almost too super for his own good. However, the Man of Steel was finally proved to be vulnerable in perhaps the most famous Superman story in the 1990s, The Death of Superman, in which Clark fought and defeated Doomsday at the cost of his own life. Still, Superman's strength, flying, heat vision, and freezing breath remain mainstays of the superhero for DC. Hey, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? Not until 2015's Men of Tomorrow storyline did Superman really get a brand new superpower, which was actually the next evolution in one of his existing abilities. During this run by Jeff Johns and John Romita Jr., Superman faces off with Ulysses, the sole survivor of another dead planet. Clark starts using his heat vision until it gets out of control, and it seems that both he and Ulysses perish in a bright explosion. Clark wakes up in the Batcave, where Batman informs him that he's developed a new power called a super flare. In essence, Superman can unleash a bona fide solar flare by unleashing all the energy stored up in his cells. This flare incinerates everything within a quarter of a mile, but leaves Superman completely powerless until his cells recharge. For 24 hours, he's totally human. So, as you can see, Superman's powers, aside from a few classics, have been a veritable grab bag of random stuff, like that wicker basket of potpourri in your grandmother's bathroom. Since 1938, the writers at DC were brave enough to take risks and continue to update one of the most iconic characters in the world. Some of his abilities might have been a little weird, but without this constant progression and maturation, Superman might not have become as loved as he is today. What's your favorite Superman power? It's the projecting little Superman out of his hand thing, right? Let us know in the comments below.